it occurred to me that wondering, why we're interested in family history and heritage. And I guess as I think about that, I think it's a sense of belonging to look back at our heritage. One could look at it with the idea of a theological implication. Some people look at it for social or political, personal, social, or political connections. But again, I think of it more in understanding the sense of belonging. I think I get a perspective from looking at the heritage. It's kind of an understanding of why we are, who we are, and it gives us then a snapshot perhaps of the future, knowing who we are and why we are. I think that as I look at it, that's why I am interested or would be interested in keeping up family history and knowing about the people who have gone before, and that's the kind of meaning I think it has for us.
In the spring of 2000, I received a grant to make a documentary about my family history. To examine the intersection of public and private history through the medium of documentary film, my proposal read, as though I knew exactly how to do that. What I did know is that I had an interest in family history, a passion for filmmaking, and a window of opportunity to combine the two. Over the next several months, I sifted through books on history and Montana, watched as many documentaries as I could find, took extensive notes on family history, and shot over 16 hours of video footage. And I'm still not sure if what I accomplished satisfies my proposal. I do know I asked a lot of dead-end questions, and started with almost no idea how to conduct a real interview. I also didn't know how I was going to arrange all these stories in such a way that they would be interesting and hopefully entertaining to those outside the family. But, proposal aside, I was after family history, and somewhere in its folds the connections between its course and that of public history. In one part to give a voice to untold stories, in another to save those stories from being lost, and in yet another to satisfy my own curiosity about the whens, wheres, hows, and whys that led one branch of my ancestors to Kalispell, Montana, and has kept them there.
I don't remember his exact height, but I'd say he's about 6'10", or excuse me, 6'1", someplace in there. He was a very erect man, lots of white hair, lots of white mustache. A little bit stained at the edges because he loved to smoke a pipe, and he smoked the old pipe that kind of came down in an S like that, and he enjoyed that. He was a great fisherman and a hunter and an outstanding smoker of wild game. When do I take a break?
Okay.
He loved to graft. He had different kinds of fruit grafted on his apple trees. There would be a branch of pears and a branch of something else, all growing on this apple tree. And so he was good at and interested in that kind of thing. And then, of course, he was really interested in fishing. There was a smokehouse behind every place they lived, I think. There was one in the back of the hotel there. I know there was one in the last house they lived, the residence that I was more familiar with over by Hedges School, we chatted about.
She, I guess it made me say it was literal translation, because she would say, open the light instead of turn on the light. And I'm sure it was shut the light rather than turn off the light. It was just, they say it would be literal the way they talked. I love the way she said watermelon. Watermelon.
Did Grandpa Corn use any
No, he wasn't much of a talker. He was more of a listener and a thinker, and he'd observe, you know, and enjoy, but he wasn't so verbal as she was, not nearly, in my memory anyway.
But he raised grapes and made his own wine underneath he had 2 big barrels underneath the steps. And of course, he learned that while he was in the old country. And by the way, he was from Austria, a town by the name of Bozen, Austria, which is now Bolzano, Italy, being partitioned into Italy after the First World War, when they partitioned the lower part of Austria into Italy.
Quite an undertaking for any immigrant, you know, to leave family and friends, particularly numbers of family, and leave with the idea of perhaps never coming back, never visiting them again. So those are probably the 3 reasons why they came to this country and to the United States, for opportunity and to get away from conscription, and because of the problems they'd had with their own children. I should say that Uncle Pete was born in this country, but when they came to this country, Marie, Dad's older sister, and he came with them, and then Pete was born here. But so actually, out of 8 children, you know, they'd lost 6 in Austria before they came here.
And then Pete was the last.
Pete was the last one, born in 1905 here just west of town.
Well, they just felt they'd made a mistake. I don't know whether it was because it was so very remote and it was so difficult to, even though Uncle George had a cabin there too, actually bigger place, but I think they just felt so isolated and it was difficult to get to Kalispell, you know. They'd have to stop a train and that sort of thing. And then, of course, with the children at school age, Rock and Marie, because Pete wasn't born until they came back. I'm sure that's right. I think they just felt lonely and just couldn't hack it.
Homesteaded the place for 5 years, and then they sold it to what then was J. Neal's Lumber Company, and went back to Austria for 1 year. Is that things you want me to put?
Yeah. Why did they go back? You know.
Why'd they go to
Why they
Austria?
went back, yeah.
Well, I think that he was considering, as I remember the story, considering going in the import business, and he wanted to go back there, and I don't know what he was going to set up, what he was going to do. While they were there, though, they could see, my grandfather could see the imminence of potential war, and conditions were very unstable, not good, and he decided to move his family back, come back here. So they came back here after approximately a year there.
So they sold all of their property in a very short period of time, in about 1908, and then would have gone back to Austria.
Do we know why they went back?
No specific reason other than perhaps family. And at that, I don't know. Yeah, the rest of it would be conjecture about the fact that they were coming to a time in their lives when they were going to have to do something else, or were about to do something else. And in that connection, I've not gone back to completely search the records, but I haven't yet found where they purchased the hotel property. So I don't know whether they were gone for a year and immediately came back and purchased the hotel property and then went into the hotel business or not.
In a one-horse town lived a Reuben Brown. Thence where he spent all his years, a city friend came down to this country town.
When Lewis and Clark traveled through what is now the Flathead Valley in northwest Montana, they remarked in their journals on the lack of game and pasture land for horses. Nevertheless, settlements in the area grew quickly in the late 19th century. By the 1870s, the river and railroad town of Damarsville had grown into a fair-sized community. But when the route of the railroad was changed, much of what had been Damarsville was moved and renamed Kalispell. In 1889, Montana was entered into the Union, and a year later, in June, Kalispell poured its first cement sidewalks. In 1910, a decade later, the first long-distance telephone service was activated in Kalispell. Dial telephones didn't arrive until 1952, and national TV came a year later in '53. Today, Kalispell remains very much a combination of the old and the new. Only a few miles from downtown, you will find small family farms still in operation, if just barely. It's the kind of community where a surprising number of people still leave their doors unlocked through the night. And there aren't that many places left like that, even in rural Montana.
Bridgeport, Buffalo, Sacramento, Pittsburgh, Newburgh, Goldberg, too. Frankfort, Freeport, Bridgeport, Newport, Hoboken, Spokane, Birmingham, Rotterdam and Potterdam and Amsterdam. Don't give a darn. My hometown is a hinky-dinky, hunky-dory town, but it's big enough for... Hey, you can have a lot of sports, you gotta look out, you don't get caught the population. The census takers say is very small. You can't find the town on any Rand McNally map at all. But just the same, the town is full of originality, full of hospitality. My old mother is the grandest lady in the family. God bless her. My hometown is a one-horse town, but it's big enough for me.
My first memory of my great-uncle, Daniel Corn Jr., or Uncle Dan as I've always known him, is of the time he pulled a practical joke on my 4-year-old self, scaring me to death with a small packet of what he called rattlesnake eggs. It was actually a piece of wire and a wound-up rubber band that snapped at my fingers as I opened the little envelope, but I hid for hours. Later I came to know him as Mo Stew, for his firm handshake, his infectious laugh, his deep voice, and his mustache. He was born in 1925 in Kalispell, Montana. This video was taken at a 1999 Corn family reunion at the old Fisher River homestead site north of Kalispell. Dan's younger sister, Catherine Corn Walterskirchen, or Kay, is my maternal grandmother. I have always known her as Munyer, a name that I gave her as a baby and her first grandchild when I attempted to say mother, which is what I heard my mom calling her. Munyer, to me, is the essence of agelessness, along with many other things. As long as I can remember, she has acted unlike any grandmother I've ever met, leading tap dancing and exercise classes, carrying on an incredibly active lifestyle, and most recently immersing herself in the computer age, taking advantage of the benefits of the internet and email. Perhaps most importantly to me, she has kept alive the memory of her late husband, the grandfather I never knew, but apparently resembled in so many ways. Although an informal man, always quick to entertain, he has been referred to in stories by his full name, Bill Walterskirchen, and no one quite knows why. Munyer was born in Kalispell in 1927. Uncle Bud, along with Uncle Dan, has done much to fill the void of my never knowing either of my grandfathers. Born James Corn in 1933 in Kalispell, Montana, Uncle Bud was our family dentist for years. He also led many of the backpacking and fishing expeditions my father and I went on while I was growing up. Some of my favorite moments on this earth come from those trips, 7 miles up in the mountains, fishing next to a glacier while Uncle Bud, ever the cook, worked over the campfire. Uncle Bud is also the family historian, and has collected, compiled, copied, and analyzed probably hundreds of documents pertaining to family history. As you can imagine, his work was an invaluable asset to this project. I tell you all this because I think it's important for you to get a sense of who these three individuals are, or, more to the point, who they are to me. I also couldn't come up with a more crafty way to introduce them, and somehow, given our common Montana experience, no other introduction, however slick, would have seemed to fit these three straightforward siblings. So, there they are.
After I came back here, after college, I ran into several of the loggers, woodsmen who were single men and had been, continued to be single men, and they were reporting to me that they had stayed in my grandparents' hotel. And those people, I ran into two of them, and they rented rooms evidently by the week or by the month, and they would be gone during the week, and then of course come back to town for the weekends and then have the room, their place in town. And I'm sure Grandma cooked for them at the same time, so they had a place to come, to belong.
My favorite recollections of I would try to go over there as many times as I could after school, as often as I could, because I would always get a treat of a couple spears of smoked canned fish, or a couple slices of smoked venison. And those were the treats that I can particularly remember. On the north side of the property was a huge garden. We raised just about, my grandfather raised just about anything you could think of. I remember one apple tree, or originally it was an apple tree in particular, that had 5 different grafts of different I guess you call it brands of apples.
I would be sent down to the basement, what did I say, the cellar. It really was a cellar because it was dirt lined and you went down kind of a stairway to get the piece of Parmesan cheese out of the crock where it was kept wrapped in cheesecake to be grated to put on the spaghetti or whatever was being cooked. They used it on lots of things, not just spaghetti. Did polenta with cornmeal, and later years, I'm digressing a little bit, but Rocca loved Fritos because they reminded him of the crispy cornmeal-y stuff that would be on the edge of the bowl when Grandma would stir up the polenta, and what was left on the edge would be kind of dried, and it would be crispy. And that's later when in the days when there were Fritos, he remembered that Fritos reminded him of the polenta. So that was fun.
There were people, Germans and Italians all over, you know, from at least 3 sides or maybe even 4 of the town that knew them. And they had kind of a neat relationship with those people, and so they congregated together. But anyway, I've heard stories about other people who came to town that knew them would say, well, we'll meet you at the Corns kitchen and the Corns Hotel before we go back to town. We'll meet you there, and then we'll go back to the farm or wherever. Flat. And I don't think so. I think this picture was
There was a certain responsibility in recording family history that I was not entirely prepared for.
those frames.
To take your relatives' words and reshape them into some kind of narrative is a dangerous thing. Whether or not I had chosen to narrate parts like this myself, my voice would have been overwhelmingly present in the choosing and arranging of my subject stories. I found myself wondering if I was really going to be able to tell their story, to do it justice. And the conclusion I finally came to was probably not. In fact, all I could do was offer my version of their version of family history. And maybe the truth of the matter wasn't so important as its meaning, both to them and to me.
They would have come over here when Rocca was about 5 or 6. And so it wasn't long after they were here that he would have probably attended school. And I'm not just sure of the sequence of his schooling, but he found out very quickly that by his going to school and being with the kids that he picked up the English language, of course, faster, and so the parents kind of learned it from him, as I understand it.
And he was an achiever and determined to do well. And when they moved back to Austria and he had to leave school here and go to school there and then return again, he lost a grade in the whole process. But he was determined that he was going to graduate the year he should from high school. So he did high school in 3 years and still was valedictorian.
Rocca would be my dad, and He's the son of the grandfather we were talking about because of the fact that they're the ones that originated this thing as far as Kalispell is concerned.
And I think he found out, obviously from his parents, that there was that it was open to him to do something different or beyond or go to the best of his ability. And somehow he picked up on that. We discovered in his papers, Dad's papers, even a number of years after his death, that his correspondence, we would find some of his old correspondence, even his ordering, like ordering a suit. And if we flipped, and he would have jotted down some notes prior to his handwriting the letter, but on the back side of that piece of paper was an outline. So he looked at education somehow and got the meaning of things because obviously in his writing skills and everything, he had adopted what he was taught, that if he outlined things and got his thoughts in order, that it went better. And obviously if he was doing it for ordering a suit, he was doing it for a lot of other more important things.
Maybe he could just see the value of it coming from Europe. I don't know. Education is certainly important in Europe, but in those days, I don't think there were the opportunities for people. And once he could see the possibilities of, scholarships and all that sort of thing, and getting away to get an education, he was determined.
Then he ran into a couple of very encouraging high school teachers at Flathead High School, which he completed in 3 years. Well, went to high school 3 years. And then he had a scholarship at the University of Chicago. And he kept that scholarship all the time he was in school. So he took advantage of everything he was taught and had to be very interested in learning what he was taught to pick all of that up.
Got a scholarship at the University of Chicago and went there to school and studied law, got his doctorate in law there. And that was where he met my mother. When he graduated from law school, he came back to Flathead, and she got a job as a language teacher at Havre High School, so they could be reasonably close, at least by train.
He had an opportunity to stay there and teach at the University of Chicago in the law school, which he decided not to do. He was coming home, and I think we've talked before about the fact that his brother Pete, who was 9 years younger than Dad, but going to the University of Chicago, had no interest in coming back here except for a couple weeks of vacation and to see his parents and to see his sister who would come up to California about when they were going to meet here. But he loved the big city. And he was very successful back there in his own right.
Rock decided he wanted to come back here and live in a small town, knowing he wouldn't make near the money that he would make in a big job in the East, but that wasn't the point as far as he was concerned. He wanted to be here.
She graduated in French and Spanish language and then taught French and Spanish in high school in Havre. And of course she came to the University of Chicago while living in Chicago.
She was born in Alabama. I have no idea how long they lived in Alabama. I gathered not a long time, and they moved to New England. And I think her dad was involved in stock at that time. And they lived there for a time, and then they moved to the Chicago area.
Her influence was primarily through her mother and her father's sisters, because that's who she was living with. But those aunties, as they were called, were all, well, they were all in the workplace, even in those days. And I mentioned to you that the matriarch, you might say, of that gathering, Aunt Fanny, was evidently a book editor at Rand McNally and Company, who put together the art and the stories for the first Mother Goose book. So, and Mother used to work for her at some point, and Dissy used to work for her at some point in time in that book department. I don't know exactly doing what, but so there was a great influence on her life of those career women who were also professionals, at least the one of them, professional in the sense that she had a pretty responsible position in a book company. And I'm sure that imparted to Dissy the interest in literature.
Those spinster women were educated and did and knew the importance of education, and were very successful businesswomen. So they had to have had a background in a certain amount of education and continuing to in the business world. Women in the business world in those days, that was pretty unusual. We had lots of books, and they talked about shipping the books from Chicago, and in fact through the years we would always get books for gifts from the relatives, the aunties, and stuff. In the room Dan and I had in that first house on First Avenue East, we had, they called it the nursery. It was the two of us had the same room before they remodeled, but on the walls there were kind of slanting roofs, like so that. But instead of wallpaper, there were great big pictures, what now would be called probably posters, but they were actual book covers that were on the wall, like Mother Goose, great big, that were actually pasted on the wall like wallpaper, that had come from Addie. So books and knowledge were important to them.
Most of the reading material I saw her get was from the library. Yeah, and I've forgotten, whether they were 3-day books or 10-day books, but she was doing that a lot. There were probably books that she bought too, but that would be, I think, the primary source that I was aware of. And then, of course, the other reading, had to do with the periodicals we've talked about. Life magazine, Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest. Those are probably the principal ones I can remember being around the house always.
Dissy was very generous about loaning books to people, but she was always would be a little bit disturbed if they didn't feel that a book was important enough to return it, and there were people like that. But it didn't stop her from being generous in loaning. And Rockham, had lots of books too. So, but they really truly were interested in that. But as I say, they were always willing to loan them. But I could remember her saying, those people just don't understand the value of a book, because wasn't important necessarily to return them. Yeah. As time went on, when she was not well, and when it would just be too much of a chore to hold a book, she listened to talking books, not audio, but the taped, like Chris does. Yeah, she did that a lot. So.
I spent my summer researching and shooting this documentary at the family cabin on the west lake shore of Flathead Lake in northwest Montana. Paradise on earth, and the rent was free. I occupied my time with interviews and reading and thinking about how to put the story together, and it was all wonderfully meaningful work in an absolutely gorgeous location. And yet, I began to feel the press of the world. That something restless that I can only assume comes to all young people sooner or later was gnawing at my 22-year-old insides. It occurred to me that this might be our last chance to make this movie. Not so much because I was afraid of losing my grandmother and her 2 brothers and their perspective into the past, but more out of a fear of losing myself to the world, to summers away from home at internships, workshops, and let's hope jobs making films. This restlessness had two effects. First, it lent my work a certain urgency, and second, it began to change the questions that I asked.
I think so. I think it was, in a sense, a sacrifice because it was so far away in those days, and of course they didn't have a pass right away. But it really was, because all her family was there. There was no one out here at that time. Later, her sister Aunt Ruth came, but it was a real change, and I'm sure culture shock from having lived in cities always, you know, where there was lots available to you if you could afford to do those things. But I think it was quite a change, and that she felt quite isolated. And then, as I say, because she was interested in people, you know, she soon made friends and everything, but still it was not like being where you could be near your family. So I think it was difficult at first.
The only thing that I ever heard about that was Dissy always missed and talked about missing spring. You know, she said there's no spring in Montana.
Mother soon, you know, didn't take her any length of time at all to enjoy being here, and there wasn't any question that it'd be adapted well, like having a place in the lake and doing that. Particularly my mother adapting to it, and she was. I didn't tell you much about her. It's unfortunate to leave the girls out as much as they have. But she was a fabulous cook, fabulous mother, extremely interested in education of her family. She could just do anything. You know.
Women in that era were supporting. They were the housewife, the homemaker, and their part of that was supporting their husbands' occupation or position or place in the community, so that she just accepted that responsibility, I think, when she came here, knowing that was her responsibility. I mean, it isn't that she didn't have her own life. She didn't have her own career, in a sense, anymore, because she didn't teach. But I think, in a sense, she taught, you know, the three of us anyway. So I don't think it occurred to her, in a sense, to be unhappy with being in small town in Montana. Dad Roger really had a flair for dancing. You know, he just loved to dance, and Mother did too. And so the two of them coming out of the 20s, the early to mid 20s in Chicago, you can imagine the dances that were going on at that period of time. And they arrived back here, and he went into this law firm of Knopfsinger and Walshley. They'd go to a dance here, and of course everybody would want to learn the step. So he decided, you know, why not share it? You know, we'll go down, we'll teach dancing, until his partners decided that was not something a young professional like Kalispell should be doing, and they made him stop.
In those days, you couldn't advertise as an attorney. Now you can, but in those days you couldn't. And the only way you could become known was to participate, besides enjoying it, but participate in community, donate your time and your talents to community effort. And in that way, people soon learned who you were and what your values were. And he was truly a public speaker and had excelled at that in high school, public speaking and debate. So it was easy for him, and then talented in writing speeches and that sort of thing. So he was a perfect person to do that sort of thing.
He was serious. You know, he was motivated, on schedule. Things were scheduled. He was used to that. And I think because of the practice of law, frustrating and anxious at times. But when he was planning a fishing trip, going to the store to buy the goodies for the boat, the food, getting his tackle out, making sure the fish hooks were shined up, all these preparations, he was a completely different person. And that's why when he got in the boat, he did so much singing. And that, of course, is where Munya learned them, and that's where Lindsay learned them, eventually, your mom, was because of his singing. He could forget the rest of the world. Everything else left his mind. He wasn't thinking about the office anymore. He wasn't thinking about his schedule anymore. So it was a real release for him.
The songs on this tape are sung by Dan Korn Sr., commonly and affectionately known as Rocca. They were recorded in the summer of 1970 by, at the request of his granddaughter, Lindsay Walters-Gershon.
Beneath the light of a bright starry night sat a lonely little Indian maid. No lover's sweet serenade had ever won her. As in a dream down the stream came a little paddling his tiny canoe. A chieftain longing to woo sang her this song.
When we were kids, they started to build a little cabin down on the East Lake Shore, Flat Lake, down just below Flat Lake Lodges. And the time frame would be about 1930. And I don't know whether they started in 29 or they started in 30. And we would spend a great deal of summers down there. Dad would travel back and forth, and we'd stay down there.
In those days, we were, among the very few people that owned at least of our friends, that owned a summer place, so it was a real treat for people to come there. But also it was, at that point in time, it was primitive enough that there was no bridge across the river, but there was a ferry, so we would, in order to get there, you could go around the lake, I'm sure, but in order to get there easily, we'd have to plan to arrive at the ferry before he would shut down for the day, and then coming back the same way. There was a schedule just like them. And if we were good, we got to buy a bag of popcorn from the man that ran the ferry. He had little bags of popcorn in his little pump house thing.
One thing that was pretty common occurrence on Sunday nights, we'd all, if on the times we were coming back to town, we'd come back to town quite often on Sunday night so that Mother could do the wash and do the grocery shopping and all those things on Monday. And Sunday night we'd be coming back in. Usually everybody was tired and worn out and could hardly wait to get home. And there was a little aggravation going on in the back seat where Kay and Bud and I would be in the back seat, initially just Kay and I. And my dad would take so much of it, and then he'd swing his arm with his fist doubled up around over the back of the seat and to take out anything that he could hit. And needless to say, the corners of the back seat were haven for Kay and I. We made a dive for the corners when we saw that thing coming. And Mother would be on Dad's case because she didn't think he was paying enough attention to the road.
This was, the living room, except the fireplace. They had made a cement base for it, but they'd never built the fireplace. So now these, it's since been done. And this was a screened-in porch. Screens all the way around, and then canvas that ran down. So now you see they partitioned it. We had those bunk beds, those blue-brown blankets on your bed right now.
Yeah.
were on the bunk beds that were down here in this end. So, anyway. That tiny little bathroom made a bathroom. But ours was always going to be this closet was going to be where the bathroom was. You know, that was the space left because then that was a bedroom. So. And there's the little trail down to the outhouse. We used to just love to play down here in the woods. We'd take boxes and make playhouses and all kinds of junk. Look at the power line. I believe squirrels have been living in here or something. No Saturday evening post covers.
Just line the wall, huh?
Mm-hmm. Every wall was just. Well, you know, there are some in there. The other one, at the other
our
side.
place.
Yeah.
Halfway through my summer of inquiry, just when I feel I have a handle on the project, its scope, its dimensions, a flood of family questions and stories unlocks itself, rushing at us full force. I begin to understand the simultaneous significance and insignificance of my work. The documentary process, and with any luck the documentary itself, provides an opportunity and a motivation for other family members to satisfy their own appetites for family history. However, as these other stories and clarifications emerge, the scope of my line of questioning seems to narrow. I am dealing only with 3 generations of one line of my family history. I am only interviewing 3 family members, ignoring a wealth of knowledge possessed by Dissy and Rocca's own grandchildren, in whom perhaps they confided in later years. In any case, I can only hope that the selective inquiries I do make continue to prompt questions, stories, and other passings on of family history. There is no way for me to cover it all, but perhaps by creating an example, the rest will have a better chance of survival, both for my family and for yours.
Radio was a real big thing for news, current news, and especially as the war, you know, was going on, because truly there wasn't television that we watched at that time, and there would be things at the movies. You know, there was always the news at the movies where you get the movie tone news would come on before every previews. It was just, you got lots of the news that way. That was like watching television, but the radio really was a big thing. It was like even with Franklin Delano Roosevelt had his fireside chats on Sunday evening, and people just watched that or listened to that just like, you know, other people watch the 60 Minutes on Sunday night. It was just, so I would say that was primarily the source of information. And during the war particularly, because you were always wanting to find out what was going on and if you have people involved, where were they and what were they doing.
That was something that, in a sense, was new. You know, I mean, it didn't, World War I didn't seem to have involved the country, the whole country, like World War II did. And at least, you know, the whole country was kind of turned upside down with the preparations and the rationing and the jobs and the men going off to the service and all the news all over the world about the war. So that was disturbing, and I picked up on that growing up.
Rocca could be more vocal about it, you know, have opinions about what was going on, where Dissy probably would keep it more to herself. But it was, you know, they were terribly bothered because, of course, that Battle of the Bulge and all that stuff that was going on was a terrible time.
And you went into the service right after you were out of high school.
Right.
And that would have been
43.
43?
And was fortunate to be selected for the infantry. I don't know what talents they were looking for, but I must have had the right ones. At that time, they had a rule that you couldn't become an infantry replacement until you were 19. So the minute I was 19, away I went. Yeah. And it was an interesting experience. I wouldn't trade it, but it wasn't probably what you enjoy doing. I had a wonderful experience going to Europe because I got a free ride on the Queen Elizabeth, which was the premier liner, ocean liner of that day and age. It's the biggest one. And, there were 12 of us to each stateroom. They had bunks stacked four high on the walls on 3 sides of the room. And so I had the pleasure of having a trip with 14,999 other soldiers, I guess you'd call them, lack of a better term. We went into Glasgow, Scotland, was where we landed, which is a beautiful spot, and took a train down to the London area, and then we went into camp there and took some more training there. Then went across the channel. They didn't have any place you could dock then. They brought the ship into the harbor, and actually it wasn't a harbor. It was Omaha Beach. And then we got into what they called ducks, which is an amphibious truck. And they took us into the shore on those things. And then we went through France into Belgium, and then into the lines at a place called Aachen. That's a German town. It was the first German town that we came to after we moved out of our positions in the woods.
That time I came home from school, from university. In fact, I was called to the dean's office once because I came home so much. You can't be part of the school if you aren't in school. But I just felt the need to come home weekends just so there would be some diversion.
When we got in our first big attack, you paid attention to the older guys, what they did. And one of them told me, he says, "Hey, now's the time to get rid of all that stuff you got on you. You don't need her." He says, "You want to be able to move." So we got rid of our overcoats. This is wintertime. We got rid of our overcoats. We got rid of our packs. We carried stuff in our backs. Got rid of those. We got rid of our gas masks. What else? Anyway, we spent the whole winter. All we had on were our socks and wool underwear, tops and bottoms, a wool shirt, wool pants, our combat boots, and a field jacket. And we went through the whole winter. That's all we had. And I mean, it was just like it is here. Winters are very similar to here, so it wasn't Antarctica or anything like that, but it was cold, and the water was cold, and ice.
In those days, I would be doing schoolwork and probably sitting next to the radio, and on certain nights we'd be listening to certain programs on radio during those years, and then of course Mother and Dad would be listening to news and things, and so I would go to bed, and pretty soon Dad would come up to say goodnight to me, and when he left my room, he never failed to go to Uncle Dan's room while he was in the service and prayed there before he went downstairs. And that's a real neat memory.
One thing we all got was trench foot. And, but I have to thank my grandmother, which was Dissy, who was my mother. Dissy's mother, we called her Dearie. Dearie used to knit me socks, and about every 2 weeks I get a package when they could catch up with us. Our mail delivery wasn't very good, It wasn't as good as our eating, but close. Because we were always carrying these K rations, they call them C rations. But she would send me 2 pair of knit socks, wool knit socks, you know, better than anybody had. And what I do is when I get the new pair of knit socks, I put 1 pair on, put 1 pair in my pocket, rolled up, put it in my pocket. Then I'd take my old ones and we'd wash them up good and I'd give them to one of my buddies. And they'd wear them because they were just fantastic socks. I couldn't carry them. We didn't have anything to carry them in. When I got home this is from overseas, I hadn't been home yet. When I got home, I got off the train in Whitefish, and Mother and Dad and I believe Kay and Bud were all there. That's what I remembered. And Bud stayed kind of away from me, which was not normal. And then he just kept looking at me, eyeballing me, you know. And when I got closer to him, he said, "Gee, you're getting old," which is probably an analysis of his in how he remembered me as to how I looked then. And I'm sure, you know, some of the experiences we went through had some effect on appearance. I don't know. And I had a mustache then, which I didn't have before. One time I had some whiskers. I don't know whether I had them then or not. So all that probably had a little bit to do with it. But
And then when you were back, you went to the It seems to me that the extraordinary in history is often made up of people doing what they see as nothing more than the ordinary, doing exactly what is asked of them. That, to me, is a pretty powerful concept. It's hard to imagine in today's world of book deals, talk shows, and merchandising tie-ins, people doing amazing things and not exploiting the glory of it for all it's worth. There is something of a quiet dignity to those who, both here and abroad, did exactly what was asked of them, anxious only to get back home to what they saw as a normal life. And because they talk about their experiences so infrequently, it can be difficult to see their part in the extraordinary. But it's there, in all of them.